Well, I happen to have a handout. I only brought 50 copies. It should do it, or get close. If you're an experienced woodworker, you may not need all of this. And some people, of course, can't help but read ahead and steal them early. But this discussion came about because a few years ago, I was putting a glue block on a blank, and I was really tired, and I was going to work on that block the next day, but I wanted to get it done. So I just kind of slapped a block on the bottom of this blank so I could turn it the next day. And a couple of months went by because I got a honeydew list and other issues coming up. So that blank sat there for a couple of months. Then I went ahead and finally got around to it, put it on the lathe, turned the glue block, put a tenon on it, and then I turned it around, put the glue block in the chuck, and before I could bring up the tailstock, the blank fell off. So I listened to the universe that day and decided I was not going to be turning that blank. Otherwise, my tricks, tips, techniques, and getting injured could have included a Darwin Award. But what had happened is that despite the fact that I knew better, I went ahead and did this when I was tired, and the blank was actually a little bit greener than I thought it was, and I put the glue block on cross grain. And people that are experienced woodworkers, this is meaningful to them. If you're a wood turner and kind of skip the woodworking part, you're kind of going, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is having it fall off and hit you or stay on it and turn. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and taking medium-sized pieces of wood and turning them into large blanks that we can work with. So I have a couple of pieces that I'll pass around too, but I've got, see, there we go. This started out as a piece of very nice maple, and I wanted to make a nice big bowl out of it. Well, it was only yay wide. You can't make a big bowl out of something that's only 8 or 9 inches wide. But if you cut it 14 inches long and put an accent strip in it, cut another piece 14 inches long, cut that in half and arrange this off center, you can make a nice big bowl with an accent in it. And if you've tried to shop and find big blanks to make things out of, unless you've got a chainsaw, they're not easy to come by. So what we're going to talk about today is gluing things up. And by the way, if anybody has any questions or comments, except from some people, I'm looking at you, Michael. We're going to go over this, and we'll start with the glue-ups. How many of you have extensive backgrounds in woodworking, building furniture and this? Okay, it's a number of people, but not everybody. I saw like 5 hands out of the room. That's a little scary to me, because it never occurred to me before I did some of this stuff that everybody didn't come up through woodworking and stumbled into wood turning later. But if you're going to do glue-ups, if we're going to start doing gluing pieces together so we can turn bowls or larger pieces, you've got to use dry wood. If you use wet wood, it's still moving. And if you've got a glue joint that's moving, you don't have a glue joint. You've got a potential failure. So, the grain orientation. Cross grain is a no-no. If you've got grain running one way and grain running this way, it's not going to bond. Even the small moisture changes in the air will cause wood to expand and contract. And if you're cross grain, it will expand and contract until there's no glue joint left there. That was one of the big problems with antique furniture. It would all fall apart because they weren't sure why that a lot of the antique furniture was built that way. So, one of the things, plywood is all cross grain, but they use special resins, they use lots of pressure and very thin woods. So, but that's why plywood is stable. I use the lathe as a clamping tool a lot. If I'm putting on a glue block or putting some things together, I will use the lathe because it's a nice feature to get the wood together. And here's a piece that I started with and went through and go ahead, pass that around. It's just bloodwood and a nice, pretty piece of quilted maple. But let's start this over here and let it go around too. But it's just, I can put it on the lathe, mark the centers, put it together, let it sit overnight, and the next day I can work on it. I use Tite Bond most of the time, usually Tite Bond 1. If it's an exotic wood, then we may be looking at using acetone and either Tite Bond something else or epoxy. But for most of the stuff, the domestic woods, Tite Bond works like a charm. Let's follow along in the notes here. Surface preparation. If you've got a well surface joint, if it's flat, smooth, it's not full of dust, and you're doing long grain to long grain, that joint is stronger than the wood. They've proven that any number of times in testing where they would glue things apart and then they'd break them. And normally the wood breaks before the glue joint does. So if you're putting things together and you've done it right, you can depend on that joint, which is kind of comforting if it's on the lathe spinning at a few hundred RPMs or 1,000 RPMs. So if it's not really flat, really clean, it's not going to work, and don't try to force it. Putting on 6 more clamps is not going to solve the issue. You cannot clamp your way out of that. When I'm gluing the pieces that are going around, I had to make sure that I glued the top, the thin part, and the middle first, because the points on the centers leave indentations in the wood. So if I glue it out of order, then I've got the bottom of my bowl has a point coming in from the bottom, and you can find that when you're turning it later if you're trying to turn it thin. So while I said you can put clamps all you want on a bad glue joint and it won't work, as long as you've got extra clamps, which I think everybody should have extra, you can use them, and it is to your advantage to keep good, solid clamping pressure on a joint. You can crank it down to the point where the glue joint is actually starved and you've forced all the glue out of it. But if you've got things just snug, then you're actually doing things right with more pressure. What happens with a clamp and a board is that you've got point pressure. So if you've got 2 boards and some glue Your clamp coming down here and here is going to be putting pressure in basically a 90-degree arc like this. So you're going to see clamping pressure in this area. So your next clamp probably belongs over here, so you can get full clamping pressure along the entirety of that joint. If you try to put one clamp on something, you may not get it to work. The small bowl I can clamp in the lathe, and it's just one point of contact. That's great. If it's any bigger than the one that's going around, what I do is I start putting extra clamps on the corners to force it together and keep everything tight. Make sense? Anybody has questions, speak up. Well, with tight bond, it will set usually in 2 hours, and it will reach full cure in 24. So overnight is a decent working time. I mean, it's workable. It's potentially workable after 3 or 4 hours, but I'm not always comfortable with that. Of course, and then your epoxies are anywhere from 3 days to 15 minutes.
This wood we have here today, let's see in our wood.
Bloodwood? In this case, you know, if you've got cherry, maple, walnut, they're all domestics. They all have very similar properties. They go together nicely. If you start using oily woods, like Ken found out with his problems in finishing, you can have problems in gluing things up. I know that I have some cocobolo rings on bowls, and I dropped one, and now I have a nice cocobolo funny looking bracelet because it popped right off the rim of that bowl just by hitting the floor. It's a decent adhesion, but it doesn't stand shock well.
What do you do to get adhesion between both the oily woods and non-oily woods?
Well, depending on how oily it is and everything, but if I'm with cocobolo, if it's small, I felt like I could get away with that, and I almost did. Yeah, I should have, if I was going to really go for a very strong joint, I would have taken acetone, wiped down the cocobolo to get rid of most of the oil, surface oils in the cocobolo, and then I would have used epoxy glues because they're less sensitive to the oil. Then you've got to start planning ahead for how you're going to mount things and whether or not you want to use a glue block, an internal tenon, an external tenon. And when you've got small bowls like this that have been going around, it makes a difference because of the foot you want to put on it. And that's just a design consideration. But it's something you have to think about before you start turning as to what kind of base and foot you want to put on that bowl, because it's going to make a difference in how it's being held in the chuck. And one of the things that you also have to watch out for too is how hard is it going to be to feel the depth of that bowl. It can get, you know, with really big bowls it can get awkward. right now I'm looking mostly at the small ones here, but again, a lot of these small bowls are just semi-scraps, really. The Here's a finished bloodwood bowl, or mostly finished, but you can see how the quilted maple really shows up in it, and it's pretty. So I had to design this to show that off, but it's only an inch thick, so a 1 inch thick bowl isn't very exciting. That's why it's got a base and a rim on it, and that's why it's pretty. And I made a lot of these because one of the club members gave me a couple of boards of that quilted maple that I thought was really pretty. He got it from a friend and he shared the wealth, so we had a wonderful time. But that's why gluing up things can be useful, is you can use smaller pieces. You can take medium-sized pieces and make big blanks. And we'll show some of that in a little bit here too. And then it's mostly, throwing it on the lathe, trying to remember the golden ratio. But when you're dealing with scrap woods, you're kind of taking your chances with that too. But, if we knock the edges off, round it up, and start turning. I wasn't planning on doing much, if any, turning today, unless somebody desperately needs to see sawdust and won't feel like it's a complete demonstration unless they get dirty, so we can do that. And then I won't go through the steps and how this is. But one of the things that is essential with small bowls and the big bowls is figuring out how deep that bowl is and using your calipers and the various things. So let's look at some calipers. There's different ways of doing this. We have your bog standard set of calipers. Everybody's probably got 6 of those. We'll have to get that in a minute. We have different sets of calipers that will measure different ways. These are, what are these? These are Premier gauges. These are interesting. They've got actually a inch meter on there, so it tells you how big it is, and it's kind of handy to be able to go through and measure with that. But one thing you do need to be aware of with a lot of these is that they're stamped metal. A lot of them have got sharp edges on them. So if you're going through and measuring your bowl, you're going to get scratches that are vertical and hard to sand out. So take the time to sand that with some emery paper or a wheel, but take that off so that, I need to take that one right down more. But otherwise you're going to be scratching your end bowl and it's going to be hard to get those. This one is interesting. This was made by one of the members here once upon a time, and you can see this measures here, and it will show you here how far it is. But Dixie Biggs made this. You remember Dixie? So I've always liked that. And then there's different ways of doing this. For a lot of little bowls, I use that. And it's just a depth gauge to see how deep something is, so I can look at the inside of my bowl. But when you do this, if you change the rim, you have to reset it. You need to remember that. Don't ask me how I know. Micrometers have also got a depth feature to them, so you can see what you're doing with that. For the bigger bowls, we got bigger gauges. I found this piece of hardware and built just made a stick to go across the top. So now I can find, on a big bowl, I can go through and feel for the depth on that bowl with this. If you don't find one of these hardware fixtures at a flea market, it's not very hard to make one. A dowel, a stick, and a little screw to freeze it. So I can recommend that. One of the things that I do if I've got a internal tenon, it's not always easy to figure out where the bottom is, but this will do it for me. This is set at the center height of the lathe. This piece, this spacer block, is sized for the Novichok with 50 millimeter jaws. So when I bring this up here, this touches exactly the Novichok jaws. So when I bring this up, that gap here represents how deep the bottom of the bowl is from the jaws to the bottom. And it's real handy to be able to figure that out. So those are just several of the ways that you can use calipers and measure things. After all, we're wood turners. If we don't have 47 different answers for one question, so that's mostly what I wanted to talk about with that. Are there any questions thus far? There's going to be a quiz later. He wants to know what type of epoxy I use. I have not done a study of epoxies. I use either a G-Flex, which has got a little bit of flex in it. I heard about that from Rebecca de Groot, and I've used it ever since. I've also got 15-minute epoxies for things if I'm trying to get it done in a hurry. And I've also got 24-hour epoxies that if I need a long setup time. But I've never found one is vastly superior to the other. It's just a question of the setup time and how comfortable I am with what I'm doing with it.
I found with epoxies, especially the longer time epoxies, that the wood is clamping can slide in it for a couple of hours, whereas with the tight bond type glues, you can move them around for about 5 minutes at the most, and then they're darn near.
They grab, yeah.
And the epoxy, you really got to hold it in place in more ways than one.
Yeah, but you also have to be prepared with that with almost any glue up. That's why it's useful to go ahead and dry clamp things together. So you can take a look at it and say, okay, have I got enough clamps? Do I have the ones I need to reach across here? Do I need to get some cawls set up to be able to clamp pressure across the top of it to keep it flat or level? Do I need to put cawls or clamp it from opposite sides to keep it even? So that's the purpose of a dry test glue up, so that you can check whether or not your glue up's going to be successful with the clamps. Because once you start spreading glue on it, you have a fairly limited time to get it all put together.
So, if you ever have trouble with these sliding compared to the other ones, you can glue everything dry with 2 grains of salt. You sprinkle a little bit of salt in the street, really spread it up with
I've heard that trick. I've never found it that useful, because mostly I'll just put another clamp across it to keep it from sliding, because salt is one of those kind of hit and miss things. It might keep it from sliding or it might not, and if I put a clamp across it, I know it's not going anywhere. But I have seen and heard that trick and even tried it a couple of times and I wasn't that impressed, I'm afraid. So, let's talk about gluing up for big pieces. If you've got a medium-sized board, you can make big blanks. No. Let's go back here and see if this is visible, and it's not. Okay. If I have, say, a 4-foot board, and it's, say, 8 inches across, well, I could make, 6 8-inch pieces out of that. I'd have 6 bowls if it was 48 inches long, and great. If that's what you want. But if you want big bowls, you can cut it up differently. If you were to cut this, remember this is going to be 8 inches. Well, if I cut this 13 inches, and this one 13 inches, and this one 13 inches, and then I split this down the middle, now I can glue up a piece that's 13 by 8, put a 1-inch walnut board in there, and then put 13 by 4 over here, and I have a big blank. So this is now 13 by 13. And if it's dry wood, and that's what I'm doing, then I've got a blank that will produce something like this. If we were to, take Oh, I definitely run them through the planer. We're going to talk about surface preparation in the next page, but well, you've already asked your one question for the evening, so don't bother. If we were to take, the 2 pieces here, we could, theoretically make a 16-inch bowl by putting the two of them together, and then we'd have a glue line down the center. Well, it's going to be visible, and it's not going to be, to my eye, attractive. Something like this, with this offset stripe in here, is attractive to me. And it may not be, everybody's cup of tea, but from what I've seen, the asymmetric design seems to work and has been very popular and received well by friends and family, and where I've actually put it on auction. And it's the same type of thing here, only I had a bigger piece of walnut and I thought, well, gee, I might as well have fun with this one. So this is cherry, maple, and walnut, and it's just fun. But it's basically a 15-inch bowl. Yeah, everybody's got to feel it, looking for, did he seen it right? Yeah. It's not the purpose, but, okay, whatever. I took a class with David Marks, and he was making hollow forms, and around the top of the hollow forms, he put a contrasting wood. He was using ebony. So you've got the hole that you hollowed it out of, and then he'd put this ebony ring over the top, and he'd make it very small, and it was a nice accent piece. And he told me, I don't really care what it looks like, it keeps the woodturners from sticking their hands in my pieces. Variations of the wave that Ken has been talking about. These are some of the types of things that John also teaches. This is a bowl, and it was put on the bandsaw when it was still square, and just an arc was cut. Just a simple arc. And then we've got some cherry and walnut in a maple bowl. And when you do this, you have to have the grain running this way so it folds over. If you try to do it this way and have the grain running here and it folded over, it will crack. You all have heard of the, wood is a bundle of straws type of thing. Well, it's true, and that's why we have the, end grain tear out when we're turning bowls and such. Well, in this case, if we're bending the veneers down, that bundle of straws will fold this way, but those straws won't bend this way. So that's why, again, it's a grain orientation thing, and it stays together and it's quite nice. And it's simple to do. It's just one cut on a bandsaw and then some veneers. You take the veneers, soak them, maybe wrap them in a paper towel, stick them in the microwave to get them steamed, and then put it together overnight. They take on the shape that you're going to use, and the next day you come in and glue it. And then you've got a square block with veneer hanging out the side of it, and you start turning it around. Absolutely easy once you know the secrets here, it's magic tricks. Then this plate looks complicated and couldn't be simpler. It's just two different color woods. I think we've got It looks awfully yellow to be maple, but I don't know what it is. I think it's maple, cherry, and walnut. But it's maple, cherry, and then walnut veneers. But you just stack a piece of maple and cherry on top of each other. They're like, 1 foot squares. Screw the corners, and then take one pass, an arc through the bandsaw. Put in the veneers, glue it back together. And then after you switch the top and bottom, then you go through, and after you've got that, you make 2 more cuts the next day, glue things back to, switch pieces, glue things back together with that walnut veneer in the middle. And then you've got two square blanks that you can turn into plates. And it's just, okay. The other plate is the identical, only this is cherry and that's maple. And for you, those of you who picked up the Formica, this is why you get a point tool, put a little line in there, and then run Formica in it. You can't do that with a burning wire. So I've got drawings here that are invisible on because they're pencil on a white sheet and a white background. But it's just how I would approach doing things to draw a circle, put in some contrasting woods, and that gives me my measurements. In that bowl, you can see that the cherry piece that I used on the outside didn't have to be 15 inches tall. It could be 8 or 9 inches tall because it was so far out on the edge of the circle that it wasn't going to be very tall when it got there. So I draw a full-size plan just so I can make sure I make the best use of my woods. Which brings us to gluing things up. I have a big piece. This is corners that I cut off the big bowl. I'm going to start this. Ken, with you, you can start this one and start passing them around. That's 20 inches across. It is as big as will fit on my Powermatic without reconfiguring it and putting the extension table on the lower setting, and it's probably as big as I'd want to turn comfortably anyway. I am not going to start turning it today. This lathe is on wheels, and I don't want to be focusing on this and have somebody yell out, "What speed are you turning at?" So we're going to leave this alone. But I could pass it around. Coward. So the question comes up, if it's critical to have good surfaces to glue, how do you get good surfaces? See, in the pieces that I'm passing around this is 4 inches thick, but it's only 4 inches thick because it's got the top and bottom are each 1 3/4 inches, and then it's got 1/4 inch of maple in the middle of it. So there's a lot of gluing up that had to happen with that. Page I'm on now is surface preparation. What methods could you use? Well, if you've got low friends in high places or a fully equipped shop because you were into woodworking, you have a jointer. And a jointer is purpose made for putting a flat surface on something. Most jointers are, the smallest ones are 4 to 6 inches, then they're 8 inches, and they go up to 12 or bigger. So you can go ahead and join surfaces with that, and they're wonderful because it is purpose made to be able to do that. Because it's a power tool, you still have to know how to operate it correctly. You have to know how you're feeding it and putting pressure on the front of it to start and holding the back steady, and where you keep pressure as you go across the knives. Because the infeed table is just a hair lower than the outfeed table, and your knives are going to make up the difference. So as you go across, you've got to keep pressure appropriately distributed there, or you're going to be, if you push down too hard, you're going to dive into it, and you're actually going to take it out of flat a little bit. But it's not something that is hard to learn, it's just you have to be aware of it. The next best tool to do this would be a planer. The planers are, again, ubiquitous in the woodworking field. A lot of people have the Lunchbox DeWalt planer or Grizzly planers in 12 or 15 inches. Grizzly goes up to 20, and then their commercial machines get 36 inches or something crazy. But you've got that. You can also use a drum sander to some extent. Drum sanders are not as flat, and on wide boards they tend to get a little uneven because they're not always perfectly parallel with the table. But again, it's something you can work with if you know your machine to get a flat surface. The table saw, if you've got nothing else, then putting on a good blade, keeping good pressure and a steady feed rate can produce a good flat surface. Be aware that if you've got a board that's curved, if it's a long board, if it's significantly longer than your fence, it will have a curve when it comes out too. Because if your fence is only, say your fence is this long and your board is this long, well, your board is going to curve around the fence. So you have to either cut your board down to the size you need it that will fit on your fence correctly, or put an auxiliary fence on. When I was doing more woodworking and I'm dealing with longer boards, I had an aluminum channel that I would clamp to my fence so that I could straighten out long boards. A router, if you've got a flush trimming bit and a router table and you're careful, and you can get things flat and squarish with that too. It's doable, but it's not trivial to do that all the time. You can see how going down through here, the methods are getting a little more awkward in places. If you're using sanders, scrapers, specialty bits, jigs, you can get flattish surfaces too. You've seen the people that are flattening big slabs by using jigs and routers and going across it. You can flatten things out like that. It's not always perfect. There's a lot of human potential for error in that. One of the things I like are hand planes. For a lot of the small stuff that I'm working on, a well-tuned hand plane is a hot setup. I've got hand planes set up to scrub things, to take off bumps, and hand planes with long beds to do wider and longer boards. So if you've got the interest in tools and hand tools, hand planes I can recommend them. The problem is that bad hand planes proliferate in the tool market. The Chinese copies of hand planes are anywhere from mediocre to truly appalling. You can get hand planes from Lee Nielsen for $400 or $500 that are wonderful. You can get custom-made hand planes for $3,000 or $4,000 that belong in a museum. They don't work all that much better, but they're gorgeous. What you can also do, though, is get hand planes on eBay. Stanley Bailey hand planes can go for 20 or 30 bucks on eBay, and if you read and look at the videos from, say, Rolly Johnson on fine woodworking, he talks about tuning up hand planes. It is a process, but if you enjoy tinkering with tools, it's kind of fun, and you will end up with a wonderful hand plane. You can replace the original Stanley blades with things from either Hawk Tools or Lee Valley, anything from A1 steels, O2 steels, PV11 steels, PMV11 steels, and they've got chip breakers that go with them. You can get a new high-end blade and chip breaker for about 90 bucks. So you could potentially have 150 bucks in a plane and have a wonderful plane. And I know because I've got several that I did that to. And I've got several more I'm about to do that to. Let's see, I don't know if I want to pass this out because I haven't retracted that blade and it is sharp. But this is a transition plane. It's a Stanley plane. It's so old that the front of it is stamped Stanley Tool and Ruler, or Level and Ruler. So it's got a wooden base and a metal blade carrying system. And they built them like this because a lot of the old carpenters liked wood. They liked the feel of wood on wood. So Stanley built these. I've had to put a new base on it because they flattened out the base on this so much that the blade wouldn't fit anymore. It was sticking out no matter how you retracted it. So I'm probably going to end up putting a better blade in this, but I think it'll be a nice plane. I'll leave it up here if you want to take a look at it. I've got a couple other Stanley number 4s. And I bought them at the Woodcraft the other week when they had their tool thing. And 30 bucks for these. And these are Stanley planes that were built between 1900 and 1907. They're just fun. They're good tools. So, the last point on the surface preparation methods is finding friends with tools. Remember the people that held their hands up when they were going with, yes, you've been in woodworking? They probably have a lot of these tools. Search them out. Buy them a beer. And then show up some Saturday afternoon at their shop. The last page I want to, I was looking at a video, and I think it was Ashley Harwood made the comment that she goes through miles of wood, her gouge sees miles of wood between sharpening. And I thought, how many miles of wood do we go through? So I started doing the math. And if my math is correct, you can go through a mile of wood on a tool in about 2 minutes, and certainly in 3.5 or 4 minutes, no matter how big the bowl is or how fast you're turning it. And if that doesn't sound right to you, it's scary. Now pen turners, okay, pen turners are a different breed. They're just kind of weird. But, so quit making faces. But the bowl turners, or to a lesser extent spindles, you know, the point is, people say, well, how do I know when I need to sharpen it? Hey, if you've been cutting for more than 3 minutes, you've seen a mile of wood on that tip, it's probably time to sharpen again. And there will be no quiz on that part. It's math. I know how most of you are. The engineers are still so-so on that. Okay, are there any questions? Anything that you want me to cover?
Does Stanley make custom blades now, kind of like what they used to make?
No.
I think like Wood River or something.
Wood River is a brand from Woodcraft, but the high-end Stanley planes were the Bedrock series, and they're high-end. They were more carefully cast, and they had an adjustable frog on it that you didn't have to take the blade out to adjust the frog.
They make something like that today.
Stanley doesn't, no. England Record makes some of those planes. Lee Valley certainly makes those. Lee Valley is making the Bedrock pattern. Their casting is based on that. They're very high-end planes. They're wonderful planes. I have several of them too. But and I found some old Bedrock planes that I've tuned up and put Hawk blades on. They're marvelous planes. I also have an infill plane from Spears Air. Stuart Spears made planes in Ayr, Scotland. And his are infill planes. They're stuffed with walnut or mahogany or exotic woods, and you adjust them with a mallet. But they're wonderful planes. The steel on them is great. I take very fine shavings with those. And of course, Stuart Spears died in 1899, so it's a little elderly. I glued a cutting board up, and I'd been making some tapered leg tables, so I had these long wedges that went from nothing to a 1/2 inch, and I put those alternately between some rectangular boards as a cutting board, and it made a very interesting cutting board. But gluing that puppy together was so messy, because as soon as I put any pressure on it, they wanted to go. I mean, these boards were literally shooting out of the board. So I had to put cauls on both ends and clamp it down in 4 different directions. But if there's no other questions, I'll give it back to Rob.
All right, thank you very much, Steve.